When we are working with communities or considering starting a nonprofit, expanding a nonprofit, making our nonprofit better, one of the things that we have to do is a community assessment. And a community can be anything. It can be a geographic population. It can be a topic for a population that's being served. For example, you might want to do an assessment on bullying, and that could be a nationwide community, quote unquote. Or it could be specifically in a school, or in the city of Chicago could also be a community. So thinking about a pretty broad sweeping terminology when we're thinking about communities. So when we're thinking about how to do assessments, which are really important, and there's no one great way to do assessments, it just depends on what works for your agency and the group that you work with. But there are a couple things that we want to think about when talking about community planning. So it's really, a macro social work focus, and there are several different approaches. So conventional is really where the professionals create the plan based on their expertise. So this is people coming in to a community and saying, this is what we find is the best resolve, and we're going to implement this plan to come up with these outcomes. The dominant rational planning, is following plans or directions that are supported or guided by public policy. So we see this fairly often in social services. I can provide you with X benefit, but not Y benefit because currently you do not qualify based on government requirements. I think food stamps, or SNAP as it's called now, is a really good example of this. And every year, actually, there's a sort of food awareness event that happens where people are asked to survive on $22.71 a year or a week, which is what people receive for SNAP benefits per person. And it's just to sort of draw awareness to the fact that that's not a lot of money to feed a person for 1 week. But because it's guided by public policy, that is the requirement that goes out, that is allotted to individuals. Action social planning is where community members participate in the planning, and they include the people that are being impacted. So they sort of create a social space for people to come in and be a part of it. And participation directed is where social workers or anyone in the field is really using an action model. It's much more of a grassroots model where community members, either individually or as a group, identify solutions that they would like to see carried out in their community, and then also participate in carrying out those solutions. So it's much more client-driven type of service. So the roles of social workers, we wear many hats in our profession, but some of the things we can do when doing assessments for communities, we can do direct service work, we can do skills building, teaching our community members how to do X, Y, or Z. We usually can create access to services, money, and resources for clients. We can also identify agendas or social issues, conflicts, different types of approaches that we want to see, and I help communities identify their agendas for their outcomes. We can do assessments, which we'll talk about in a few more slides. We could interview key players, and what I mean by that is maybe leaders or people who have been the hardest hit by whatever social issue you're focusing on, etc. We can create context, and what I mean by that is boundaries, rules, regulations. So, maybe in creating a safe space for domestic violence survivors, there would be a lot of rules and regulations about who could come, where the agency is located, who has access to knowing where that agency is, etc. And then sometimes one of the best things we can do as service providers is provide feedback from an outside perspective. So we may be working with a population or community, and they're so ingrained in the situation that's happening that sometimes an outside perspective can be really helpful for sort of an alternative approach or just another opinion that can really be beneficial. And I've seen that work really well, and I've seen that sort of backfire. It just kind of depends on how you approach those things. So this is an assessment framework, and what I mean by this is sort of not necessarily the steps. Well, I guess they are steps, but in reality, you would never follow steps 1 through 6 to do an assessment. It never is that straightforward or easy, but sort of the tools that you would need to do an assessment on a population or a community when thinking about identifying different populations. So you're going to be really doing a needs assessment for one of your assignments, and essentially you're identifying the population and you're going to make a case to why this population needs services and support. So we'll walk through sort of all of these as well. And I can also provide a framework that's a little bit more detailed that will help you think about questions that you might want to ask when doing your assessment. And I'll post that up on D2L as well. So first thing, obviously, identify your target population, which is pretty straightforward. But this is where you're going to do some research. You're going to want to find statistics and facts and maybe stories about the target population you're focusing on. And then you're going to talk about what that need is for that community. And like I said, I'll post the framework for assessing community as well if it's not already up. And you can take a look at that and see what's helpful. So really, it's going to be a couple of paragraphs that have a lot of data and reports that are backing up sort of what you're finding for this population. You want to identify what the boundaries are. So if you're going to provide services in the city of Chicago, you could geographically make it the city limits. If it's going to be the Northeastern campus, for example, you could identify if you're going to include all of the schools or some of the schools, if you're going to include the entire student body or just certain programs, etc. So you would want to come up with those different types of boundaries. You want to figure out how the population defines its issue or need versus maybe how the larger community or general population identifies it. So say you're focusing on gang violence, how does the community identify their needs and issues versus what is the perceptions of maybe the greater Chicago area. So if you were focusing on a school or maybe a 10-block radius in the city of Chicago that has high gang violence, you would want to find out what that community sees as the issues and the problems and possibly the solutions. You'd also want to see what that community identifies as their strengths in combating an issue like this. So maybe they're well organized, maybe they work well with the police force, maybe they're creating safe community spaces for children, etc. And that was also going to lead you to understand sort of dominant culture. But then you might want to think about bigger picture. The city of Chicago may have a very different opinion of this neighborhood and what their strengths and weaknesses are, or what the solutions are for a community. A lot of times, for example, we hear stronger police force, harder laws, more arrests, etc. And that might not be the perspective of that community per se. And you also want to think about any oppression or discrimination that's sort of happening with that group when you're thinking about those types of things. An example of this would be, for example, working with maybe the homeless population in Chicago. There are a lot of things, a lot of barriers, if you will, that run the risk of people facing oppression and discrimination. People with mental health issues are getting arrested versus receiving treatment, things like that. So considering all those different pieces as well. Let's switch slides here. So a few other things you want to think about. Figuring out what resources are already available. So maybe you want to focus on homelessness in Chicago. We have a decent structure of nonprofits and organizations and city and government entities that address this issue. But I'm sure there's some areas that are missing. I had a student who did her final project on this and recognized that public showers and clothing and those basic needs were really pretty unavailable to people because it's hard to create a safe space to have a public shower situation, as you can imagine. So thinking about those different types of things, what's available, what's not available to them, what service delivery units, so, are there nonprofits? Is it all government funded? Is it, are the police doing things? Who is providing services? Figuring out those different things. Who controls sort of the money is one of the things that I always sort of think about as well. So is it funded by the city and it can change based on who's in office? Is it grant funded and the funding ebbs and flows based on the money? Are there political ties to this type of thing? One of the things that Mayor Rahm Emanuel ran on when he was running for office in Chicago was homelessness and food deserts, and so those two issues got a lot of attention and a lot of funding, and then all of a sudden that funding sort of dried up and those issues are no longer sort of being furthered because of it. And then you also want to identify, of all the entities that are working together or working to address this issue, are they working together? Are they separate? Do they overlap in services? Considering all of those different pieces to the puzzle. So essentially, you won't do this part for your paper, but essentially once the next step is identified, so you figured out who your population is, what the need is in that community, what the possible outcomes and solutions are, you would, in theory, if you were starting a nonprofit, write a proposal, which is essentially what your final project is. So you would come up with all the different things, what you think the solutions are, what you think the programming is, and what you identify as your outcomes. And maybe you were going to apply for grant funding for this. Then that grant program would vote on what they think should be funded or not be funded, and then you would sort of work from there. So it can be a pretty tumultuous process when thinking about all of those different pieces. So after you, write this proposal and come up with your outcomes, all that stuff, which we'll focus on more specifically as we move through things. One of the things that you also want to consider is how you're going to show people or the public or your funder how you are being successful. So what are all the steps that you're going to do to implement your goals, to implement your programming? So, obviously you'd have to hire staff and you'd have to hire qualified staff. And then what is it about what you're going to do in your program that's going to make things successful? You're going to have to educate the community, the clients, etc. And so there's all these different steps that you would go through to sort of influence how things are becoming implemented, etc. So, excuse me. You roll it out essentially and you build support around it and you engage the community and you focus on sort of all of those different pieces to the puzzle. It sounds really straightforward and easy, but as we saw when we were doing the organizational chart structure last week, sort of the realities that nonprofits often face in terms of lack of resources or those types of things can be a struggle when rolling out programming. So say you've got your nonprofit up and running. One of the things that you definitely want to do is consider how you're going to identify success. And the next piece we'll talk about creating goals and objectives with that. But you're essentially going to create measures and markers. So maybe one of your goals is to recruit 150 new students to your program in the first year. So that's pretty easy to measure, right? You either hit 150 or you don't. Maybe you want to see a decrease in homelessness in the city of Chicago overall. So that's a little bit more tricky. How are you going to count people? What do you consider success? All of those different pieces. And how would you even count folks? How would you go out about and doing that? And so thinking about all of those different pieces, sometimes you're going to have to maybe realize 3 months in, oops, this isn't going to work. We need to redo our goal and readjust and sort of reassess. So you might need to restructure. And at the end of a year, what you're going to do is tabulate all your data and present it to your funder or the government or whomever is ensuring that your programming is running. So I did create a link down there. So there's some information about the plan to end homelessness for the city of Chicago. We are going to actually talk about that in class. So if you want to take a look beforehand and peruse it, it's a really good example of planning, implementing, monitoring, evaluating, sort of really doing an assessment on a community which they're identifying as a community of people who are experiencing homelessness. So thinking about all of those different pieces to the puzzle as well. And then we'll also talk about in the next, in class, we'll talk about how to create goals and objectives for your agency and what that looks like, because those can be fairly tricky as well. So I will see you all in class.